to part 2 of watercolour techniques for beginners. I'm Catherine and I'll be showing you another 4 ways to use the wet in wet technique. Wet in wet technique is when we wet the paper first with clean water and then apply the paint. It's one of the most popular ways to use watercolour and also showcases the unpredictable nature of this medium. If you're painting along with me, these are the materials you're going to need before we start. Watercolour paint in pan or tubes, a mixing palette, 2 jars, one for dirty water for cleaning brushes and the other for clean water to paint with. I'm using a couple of different sized round and flat brushes and you need some good quality watercolour paper. I'm using a 300 GSM watercolour block. A block is sheets of paper that are glued together on all 4 sides. This prevents your paper from buckling when you put water on it and it will dry nice and flat. You can use a single sheet of watercolour paper. If it's thick, just tape it down, or you can stretch it. Check out the other tutorials on my channel, materials for beginners and how to stretch paper, to see how this is done. Okay, we're going to start by mixing some colours in our palette. Make sure you get a good amount of each colour mixed and make them fairly strong. To do this, take a clean wet brush and use the water to activate the paint in the pans. The more water you use, the weaker the mix. I'm using alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, sap green and gamboge hue. Remember, you can use whatever colours you want to. Use masking tape to section your page into 4 and we're going to start by refreshing our memories of a variegated wash, but we're going to use 2 colours. I'm using the flat brush to apply the water to the first section. Cover it with water evenly, we don't want any puddles forming. Now I'm using the large round brush to take some paint and drop it onto the page. There's no right or wrong here, just remember to leave some white spaces for your second colour. Don't fill the section either. Leaving the edge of where you paint inside the area of the wet paper will create a lovely soft edge as the paint blends with the water. With a clean brush, do the same with the second colour. Because we wet the paper with clean water first, the colours we added will just blend together nicely. You can add more paint to create darker areas of colour, but try not to dab with the brush too much. The idea is to let the paint do the work on the page. So I've got a little bit too much water on here. You can see it puddling in the middle. If you spot this quickly, it's easy to correct. So you can see I'm using the brush to gently lift the excess by drying it on the tissue paper, then dabbing where I want to remove the paint. You can use the same technique to tidy the edges as well. Okay, our second experiment is going to look at watercolour blooms. For many people, a bloom is a mistake, but if you know how they're made, you can either avoid them, or if you like the effect they create, you can make them on purpose. I use blooms in my paintings sometimes to create texture or lighter areas, so let me show you what they are. Let's start with a flat wash. That's when we apply the clean water first and then a single colour in broad strokes. We want to make an area of solid flat colour. Now while the wash is still wet, take your round brush and wet it with clean water. Then drip the clean water onto the wash on one side of the square. What you can see happening is the fresh water displacing the pigment. As it dries, the edges form lots of little branches, and this is what we call a bloom. I've repeated it with paint as well, just to show you another way to use it. It's easy to see why you might want to avoid this happening in your work, but you can also create some unusual patterns that look great. So we're going to have some fun now and create some paint splatter. The easiest way I've found to do this with some control is to take a clean dry brush in one hand and then tap your paint loaded brush on top of it. I've wet the paper first so that the paint splatter will blend out where it hits the page. The splatter or spots will depend on the size of the brush and the amount of paint you use, so this really is for you to experiment with and find what works best for your painting. Take your paint loaded brush in one hand and a clean dry brush in the other and tap it on the handle. Another way you can do this is by taking some tissue paper and wetting it slightly, then dipping it into the paint. Hold it from a height above your page and squeeze. It will deliver a large drop of paint, so it's definitely worth practicing before you use it on your masterpiece. The last technique I'm going to show you in this tutorial is how to lift paint. We touched briefly on this in the variegated wash, but I'm going to go into more detail now as this is an important technique to learn. It will give you some control back over the unpredictable nature of watercolour. Using this to recover from small mistakes is really handy. Begin with the wet in wet technique, and while the paint is still wet, I'm going to start to lift the paint away from the edge. Make sure the brush is clean and blot most of the water from it on some tissue. The brush should just be lightly damp. Gently dab the area that you want to remove the paint from and dry the brush on the tissue as you go along to make sure that you're still absorbing the water on the page. You can see where the paint has lifted and I've recovered a lighter area which will blend out nicely because the paint is still wet. Another way to do it for more immediate results is by using tissue paper. So press firmly to remove a lot of paint or dab lightly for a softer effect. So wait for it to dry completely or help it along with your hairdryer. Gently take the masking tape off and make a note of what each experiment is. So there we go, there's another 4 ways to use the wet in wet technique completed. Hope you're enjoying painting along and learning something new, and if you want to keep up to date with new tutorials, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thanks everyone, and see you next time.